The poet William Butler Yeats ended one of his poems with a very cryptic inscription that said, "In dreams begins responsibility." And now what do we do with this statement? There are different ways to interpret it. I'll give you two radically different versions of that. One is the artist, the creative, the poet's kind of descriptions that says, if you have a dream of something, of a concept or of a world or of a person, a story, it is your responsibility to bring this idea into the real world. From your subconscious, from this nebulous amorphous space, you have to bring it into the concrete space of reality, in the form of a book, in the form of a poem, in the form of a movie, in the form of anything. That is one way to interpret it. Another way is the rather invasive idea that where you know, a dream almost becomes a thought crime in an Orwellian sense. That if you have a dream, if you have an idea, if you have a thought, you're already responsible for that thought. You're already responsible for it. You can already be held accountable for it. You can already be criminalized for it. You can already be abused for it. You had that thought, you had that idea, you had that. Yet, how did these two completely opposite interpretation of that come into existence? And that leads me to the idea and the topic of that little video here. I would like to rephrase Yeats' quote, "In dreams begins responsibility," to "on screens begins responsibility." Now, we all have today, and that sounds a little perverse perhaps, but that's completely intentional, we have relationships with our smartphones and our computers. And I'll explain that in a second, what I mean by that. But first of all, let's go back to the halcyon days when the internet was a new thing, a new phenomenon, a virtual space. And here we are closer to this sort of creative idea of "in dreams begins responsibility", because it is a space where our subconscious can roam free. It's like an extension of our minds. Suddenly we have this space that is not only an extension of our minds, but it's like a form of hive mind, a network, a malleable, connectable place where we can all meet and where our minds can almost meet directly. Where we put what we used to put into books or on songs or into poems, this creative expression of ourselves, we can put it in a space. We can leave it there and we have other people looking at it and interacting with it. And it's almost like we invite people into our minds. So it was a space of almost limitless possibility for a while. And now we get to what the internet is today. It's a completely different place, I would say. It's no longer a place where our imagination or our subconscious, well, it's not a virtual subconscious anymore, it's a virtual representation of the outside world. And now let's get back to that idea of our relationship with our little gadgets. A very simple kind of experiment. It's very subtle, so you've all noticed it, but perhaps you've never consciously noticed it, is that your computer, if you use it habitually, and who today is not a habitual user of a computer, gets used to you. It learns from you, it learns your habits, and it learns them very, very well. It's a very subtle and insidious little thing, your smartphone or your laptop or your PC or your Apple, whatever you're using. Because you go on a search engine, you go on YouTube, and the inherent algorithms of these sites, they learn your habits, they learn what you are looking for, and they get better at finding what you are looking for. So they present you exactly the world that you are looking for, because they've learned it. And so they create this sort of relationship with you, outwardly, or probably in the words of their creators, they are learning with you, they are adapting to you. If you use somebody else's smartphone or somebody else's computer and you go on YouTube and you look for something, you're probably not going to find it immediately because this computer is used to another person. So in a way, bear with me here, in a way this is almost like having a very rudimentary glimpse into the mind of somebody else. You see their predilections, you see their preferences, you see what they like. for a moment there, if you want to look at it as that. It's a way to look into somebody else's mind, or the virtual, the electronic extension of their mind, which is what these computers are today. Alright, so far so good. But where are the problems now? Where are the problems now? Because from this creative limitless space, the internet has today turned into that representation of the outward world. Yet we have internalized it. We are no longer aware that this computer world is the outside world, because it is at the it's like at the edge. Like we are interfacing. The outside and the inside world are interfacing in a computer, and quite often we can't tell which is which. So most of the outside world has been turned into a virtual form. Almost everything that exists in the outside world has its virtual equivalent. So we have in the internet a virtual representation of our outside world that we are interfacing with in a very internalized way. It's not like we are going outside, we are inviting the world into the extension of our mind, into this little handheld computer thing that we use. And so we engage with it differently. And that is why an online debate or anything that happens online has a much greater and much more noticeable impact on our emotions quite often. Because it is like something has invaded our minds and is telling us not only is something happening outside, it's happening inside as well. And while we may consciously be aware of that, subconsciously we still feel this impact much stronger. Something that happens far, far away that we could, if we were to see it on the outside, react to as an external observer to it. Suddenly we can't do it because it happens inside our minds. It becomes, in a way, much more our own responsibility than something that would happen outside. But, at the same time, it is happening outside. So what do we do with it? It's a very weird thing. And it also takes away from us one fundamental liberty, I think, is the liberty of our minds, where we are free to imagine and free to think. Because quite suddenly, within our minds, is this, because we are so interfaced with the computer, this virtual representation of the world, in our heads, the entirety of the time, is the world, a virtual image of the real world that we can't get away from. So our minds, in a way, are no longer free to imagine anything, because we constantly have these reminders of the real world in it. And even if we want to go away from that, what do we turn to if we're used to a virtual world? We turn to mindlessly scrolling through Facebook, we turn to video games, we turn to pornography, we turn to anything that will dull our senses and dull our minds. Because we don't have this feeling of liberty that our minds used to be. We don't have this feeling of a dream is a place of complete unreality where we can feel free, where we can imagine freely. It's no longer possible for many people. Because most of it, or a large part of the subconscious, as I said before, has been replaced with a virtual representation of the world. All of it, the dog-eat-dog, corporate kind of idea, like fighting each other, the avatars, the virtual representations of not only other people, but of corporations, of businesses, of everything, exists right in here. And this is something that we have to get away from. This is something that you have to learn to distance yourself from. That even a virtual representation of the outside world is still in a way the outside world, and your mind still has to remain free to be able to think and to be able to imagine something that can be enjoyable, that can be frightening, that can be politically incorrect, that can be stupid, that can be gorgeous, wonderful. This is what our minds are. They are this sort of playground, and it is the only way we can go back to a truly free sort of imagination. Well, food for thought here. Today I'll just wish you imagine the best kind of stories and don't tell them to anyone. Your secret private stories. Take care.